Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Resiliency and Business Continuity in the Cloud Era, sponsored by Broadcom. My name is Carol Auth of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Dave Shackelford, SANS Senior Instructor, and Chris Newman, Cloud SWG Principal Product Manager, Broadcom Enterprise Security Group. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the Q&A window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. Today's webcast is part of the SANS Cyber Series 2025, a free 5-part webcast series designed for security practitioners and leaders seeking actionable strategies to strengthen their cyber defenses. Led by renowned SANS instructors, including Dave Shackelford, Kevin Garvey, Greg Scheidel, Ted Demopoulos, and Matt Bromley. Each session delves into the critical topics such as cloud resiliency, data loss prevention, defense in depth, and hybrid environment security. Attendees can earn up to 5 CPE credits and gain practical insights to apply immediately within their organizations. Explore the full lineup and register for individual sessions by scanning the QR code or clicking the link in the chat window. And with that, I'd like to hand it off to today's presenters.
Awesome. Hey, thanks, Carol, and thanks everybody for being here with us today. Super excited to be joined by Chris and the team at Broadcom. And just sort of reflecting on the topic within the series that you see listed here before we move on to today. There's so many questions swirling about out in the industry, especially for organizations that are shifting to like a complete remote work scenarios. They're getting away from the data center that they've known and loved. That's definitely tongue-in-cheek over the years, where, hey, maybe some of the controls that we're used to aren't available to us anymore, certainly not in the same formats that they have been. And there's a lot of organizations really going through that shift, going through that transition. And that's definitely a big theme for what we're going to be discussing here today. How can we ensure that we're protected at all times in the case where there's maybe some new dependencies on third parties and some interconnectivity across these brokered types of cloud solutions that we haven't had in the past, right? I mean, we could always sort of rely on ourselves in the old days. And now we have new, sort of intermediaries in the mix that may or may not necessarily meet some of those same requirements in terms of uptime and, and so forth that we've been used to having on our own. So it's a great conversation. In fact, and Chris, I didn't even get a chance to chat with you about this coming into things. But just prior, I'm not even exaggerating, just prior to jumping on this webcast today, I was having a conversation with a US federal agency who was, in fact, really concerned about exactly this. He said, well, we've shifted out to this remote workforce. Everybody's getting their security control application through a cloud brokered format. And we're starting to explore just things that we could do in the case that something doesn't work anymore, right? Something goes down, something doesn't work. And so it very much was a continuity conversation, but it really revolved back to new dependencies and things that they weren't wholly comfortable with. And so they were trying to explore some options. And in fact, it was funny. I said, well, I'm getting ready to jump on a webcast with Broadcom about this exact topic. You should hop on too, and we'll hear all about it. But with that said, let's dive in. So hopefully everybody's ready for a exciting disaster continuity and so forth discussion. It's all about resiliency, though, and really what we're talking about here is new forms of resiliency for controls that are table stakes, sort of the baseline of things to protect your end users that are now manifesting in different formats than we've had in the past. And for most organizations, so I do a lot of work in disaster recovery and continuity. And it's tabletops, it's the full, hey, what are our metrics, how long can we go without these controls? You get the idea. These riveting things that we take for granted in many cases. And what I find quite often when organizations produce the inevitable spreadsheet of tier 0, tier 1, tier 2 types of controls that are required for their organizations, there's really a lack of comfort with some of the cloud-based solutions. They might be on those spreadsheets. Sometimes they're not, actually, which is kind of funny because people go, "Oh my gosh, we didn't even think about this." So okay, we'll sort of set that to the side. But assuming that you've got those controls in place, many organizations have very little in the way of fallbacks. They don't have workarounds. And so if X, Y, or Z service becomes unavailable or experiences undue latency or has some sort of other problem, what's the recourse? What's the solution? What's the plan? And what's your tolerance level with regards to risk in that regard? And many organizations don't really have that well, sort of put into place in terms of strategy. So, okay, here's the agenda. Let's talk about the cloud overall. Let's talk about some of the things that are going on out there. We'll talk a bit about outages. These days, I mean, it's 2025. Anybody that's been paying attention could probably cite at least one or more outages that have either impacted them directly or that they've heard about in an ancillary fashion. So, I mean, this is not new. We got to talk about planning. We have to talk about some of the compliance factors that are coming into play here. And then it's all about strategy and where we're going, right? So we have a lot to discuss. Again, super excited to be joined by Chris Newman from Broadcom. So, hey, Chris, say hi. Yep, Chris is going to be hanging out with me. Yeah. And again, talking shop about, frankly, a really important topic that's, all these years into the cloud, especially with people going cloud first, organizations doing lift and shift, they're sort of moving everything out. We've really got to come back and circle to the core functionality that's needed to represent a resilient infrastructure. And we've sort of had the dual data center model, the active. I mean, all these things over the years. But when you move into the cloud, there's these sort of real shifts towards a single provider for something, and very often we sort of just take it for granted that that provider is going to be having a good day every day. But what if they don't? What if those providers don't have good days every day? And I think it's okay to have that conversation. So, here's the question: is the cloud resilient? Sometimes. I'd like to say most of the time, right? I think for large major providers, there is a comfort level that we've sort of settled into. They've got SLAs, they've got contractual requirements and things that you feel comfortable looking through and sort of signing off on and saying, okay. In the shared responsibility model, your uptime is wholly your responsibility. And so we're going to go with that, hopefully. But we've seen cases, like I said, over the course of the past couple of years in particular, where, things happen. And so you have to bring this into the discussion, right? Any organization serious about disaster recovery and continuity has to step back and take a look at this and say, look, there's just more factors than ever before. And not all of them are wholly malicious in nature. I just want to emphasize this. This is not a doom and gloom, we're always under attack kind of discussion. It's really just the nuts and bolts of how things work. Could you experience a denial of service that causes disruption in your cloud service? Yes. Could you have some form of attack, maybe from within, however that manifests, that could in fact lead to disruption? Yes, again. But could you have a mistake, right? Could you have someone that makes a misconfiguration actually go into production? We've seen this movie before, doesn't always end well. Could it be a case where other sort of ancillary factors around that service within a particular region or geographic territory are experiencing disruption? Maybe it's telecom providers that are having problems. Maybe it's some of the backbone that's experiencing issues. The list goes on and on and on as to why there might be some disruption. But the fact of the matter is, there is in fact going to be disruption within some of your cloud services. It's almost inevitable to see that happen over the course of the next couple of years. If you haven't had this happen already, I don't think it's a bad bet to say, hey, we probably need to be thinking about this for when it ultimately does occur. And that means, again, we get to sort of the last question on the slide. How do we start building out business continuity models for cloud services? What does that look like? Is there redundancy available? How do we put that into place? I think there's more questions than answers on the part of many organizations. And I think that's one of the big goals here today, is to talk through some of that and really help people understand that, increasingly, there are actual solutions that can help you, basically say, yes, we're covered here. In the case that this doesn't work, we can, flip over to this one, much like you would for sort of a primary, secondary for things like DNS or any other sort of network gateways or all the core services that you've relied upon just to be functional with regards to your business over time. So that said, what are the risks? I think increasingly today, and Chris, chime in on this because you talk to a lot of customers out there. But really, what I'm
Mhm.
finding is that over the last, I would say, 5 years, I'm going to give it a 5 year spread here. Cybersecurity has become much less of a nice to have and much more of a need to have,
Yeah.
which means that it's sort of bubbling up further in the list of criticality with regards to services and functions. We cannot be without X, Y, or Z. And these are, like wholly security based services, particularly those that are protecting your end users. Are you seeing that same shift happen in the clients that you're talking to out there?
Yeah. I mean, I think we see it much more in regulated environments, of course. So like
Mhm.
financials, government, like that kind of thing. Like that's always been true. And I think their appetite for risk is much lower than other organizations are out there. But I
Yep.
think, more recently, I think we've seen more and more kind of resistance to, oh, if there's an outage, I would just open things up and, once it's back, I'll close things back down. Like losing visibility, not knowing what state you're in when you come out of it, is just becoming less and less acceptable. I think because of the number of incidents and attacks and other things that are going on, you know, it may not be worth it. In which case, that means that, depending on what we're talking about, you're looking at a business outage. And depending on the circumstances, that could be short or long. And the costs associated with that are, the classic security trade-off. So
No, I think that's exactly true. And the thing that I find interesting is that the sort of spread or sort of the scope of the types of services that we've classically considered in those high risk categories is growing. Think about the number of organizations that have shifted completely away from anything having on premises presence at all for some of these core services. I always sort of jokingly describe, and actually, it's a great time to just shift over to the next slide here. I always sort of jokingly describe the concept of things like content filtering, right? Content filtering, categorization. That's absolute baseline, and it's to protect people from ending up in the bad neighborhoods of the internet. You really don't want that. Nobody wants that. There's a lot of those bad neighborhoods, and you're not going to be able to accomplish that on your own. You have to have something in between the end users trying to get to things and the attackers that are obviously trying to redirect them and sort of lure them into places that they shouldn't be. What happens if that goes away completely? You sort of got this open environment for people to be able to go to anything at all. Not necessarily that they're typing in a URL on their own, but maybe they clicked on something, or maybe there's a browser, sort of based redirect. I mean, there's just so many ways that people can end up in those places. Again, I come back to the question, what happens if that goes away? What is your risk profile if people can get to anything, anywhere for an amount of time? And I'm finding that the tolerance for that risk-wise is very low, actually, right? For a whole lot of reasons, whether it's just liability or the concern for malware implementation. I mean, you name it, right? There's all these sort of factors that go along with it. But this is
I,
sort of a list. I won't read this whole list to everybody. You can gaze upon the list of what we sort of consider core capabilities for all of your end users to be protected. But nobody wants any of that to go away, right?
yeah, I would even add that it's also about loss of visibility. That yes, people suddenly would be able to go to stuff that could be potentially malicious or whatever, but you won't know it anymore. And that's almost more disturbing. When you come out of that situation, you don't know what happened. And so like you could have all sorts of things potentially happening and you're playing catch up at that point.
Yeah, that's a fair point because you're basically shifting to the telemetry that might be present locally on the endpoint only.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
okay, how long does it take to get that? How deep does it go? Is it
right.
effective? You're starting to ask new questions that are increasingly uncomfortable without having that intermediary layer that you've been reliant upon for so long. And I think that's fair. Yeah, like the lack of observability on that is definitely a high risk as well. And again, you go down this list of what I consider critical services or core services. And look, we're speaking to a wide audience. For some of you, you'll be looking at this list and saying, yep, 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 data loss prevention, definitely my top, concern or my top control that has to be in place. For some others, it might be malware protection. For some others, it might just be site content filtering. But I think collectively, you look at those capabilities and say, yeah, they're probably important to the vast majority of organizations who are out there in some capacity. And if all of them are concentrated in one place and they just go away, you potentially have some big risks, right? You have some big problems that could be taking place. And, I don't know exactly what the, sort of like average in the industry is these days for compromise of an end user when they're unprotected. there's a lot of those numbers floating around out there, but I can say over the past, probably 10 years that number is going down, right? You're less safe in a shorter amount of time than you ever have been before. And I think that has to be taken into account as well, is that, you don't have a big window where, oh, okay, we can wait a couple of hours and people are probably fine. People increasingly rely on internet access and online cloud services in order to get their jobs done. So irrespective of whether the controls are there, they're still out there doing a lot of things that could put them at risk. And so you really want to make sure those controls are there, 100% of the time. If they're not there 100% of the time, you want it as close to 100% of the time as you can possibly get, right? So I think that's a fair way to look at it. But, those numbers are only going to go down. Increasingly, we're finding attackers that are coming out and just constantly, trolling for people to be exposed or find some avenue of access. And end users are increasingly that first avenue of access. We know this. We've seen this over the, a lot of years. Without these services in place, you're certainly putting yourself at risk. And, look, we could probably hang out here for a while, Chris, and just talk about outages. I think this is our one doom and gloom slide. I think in this in this discussion, there's always one. Anytime you talk about things that could go bad, you got to have some examples or representative examples in any case. It's funny. I do a lot of tabletop exercises with clients, and one of the things that I will occasionally bring into the mix to try to get everybody engaged is, okay, Microsoft is completely out of the picture right now. What are you going to do? And nobody ever thinks that'll happen, right? There's always sort of these just expectations. Well, wait a minute, though. I mean, it's Microsoft. There's no way that that's going to happen. Well, turns out actually has. There's definitely been outages there, but you could just kind of go down this list of not only just Microsoft as a whole, of course, that's sort of a big one, but look at some of these really large providers that have extraordinary resilience capabilities, lots and lots of scale. They're globally dispersed. I mean, go on down the list of things that sort of represent this. But you look at the majority of the ones on the slide. I mean, Zscaler out back in 2022. The number of organizations going to and through everything through Zscaler. Zscaler's gone. So what happens in that case? You just don't go anywhere. People can't get to things. They're unprotected. It really serves to, I think, illustrate that it can happen to anyone, right? These kinds of problems can absolutely occur to any of the providers, just like they could happen to you, whether it's a particular service or just a large scale disruption overall. It's important to make sure you're thinking about the what if scenarios if that occurs, right? Anything you want to cover on here, Chris, specifically? Because I know there's some interesting ones, especially with the supply chain attack that's at the end.
I mean, I would just say that as somebody who runs large cloud services, every time I think of data center outages, it puts a shiver in my back. That we've had to deal with these. Basically, every single one affects us because we're everywhere, and so how we go about doing that is really difficult and not perfect. And even as I've been doing this, the number of ways that things can go wrong, I mean, the classic web security joke is it's DNS, it's always DNS. But there's a million other ways that things can go on, can run into issues. Even something as kind of prosaic as, a noisy neighbor can cause major problems. And so, I'm looking at this from the other side of the table because I'm the one who owns the service. But it's definitely, it's something it's such a complex problem that I don't think it's not something that's going to be solved by any means. If anything, things are getting worse as they get more complex.
No, I think that's fair. And I think the nature of how these types of scenarios unfold is growing, sadly. Right. So I mean, obviously everybody knows the DNS, sort of cliche there, but speaking as a former network engineer, we sort of always used to have this spidey sense tingling about BGP, right? Like,
Yep.
oh, this is going to be the problem. And it could be the problem. Today it could be the problem. Tomorrow it could be the problem. But there's this interconnectedness across the space that we all rely upon. I love the noisy neighbor comment. It could be a noisy neighbor, but in the case of this auto dealership supply chain attack, it was a third party that distributed bad things that you were a part of, and it just sort of coalesced from there, right? We're all connected in a lot of ways. And by the way, your cloud service providers also have third parties, and they have third parties. It's turtles all the way down on these kinds of things, and we're seeing that. We have seen that for some time, and so it is good to start thinking about the possibility of disruption in a lot of different ways. It could come from a number of different avenues, and there's no finger pointing here, by the way. I definitely want to call that out. As somebody that's run some very large scale infrastructure myself, it absolutely can happen. In fact, I sort of jokingly remember, this was years ago. It was probably what like 2014, 15 timeframe. But there was a massive AWS outage in their S3 infrastructure on the East Coast, right? Sort of the East Coast of the United States. And I honestly, I felt like they were very forthcoming about the root cause of this. They basically said, yeah, we made a mistake at the command line. Like an engineer had basically tried to cull some of their buckets and, sort of like bring those things back up, these nodes, and had somehow mistyped something, which begged the question, why wasn't there a little more automation in that? Don't know. But, back to it, I looked at this and said, wow, I mean, if it could happen to the whole sort of, eastern seaboard of the United States S3 service because somebody made a typo, these kinds of things could absolutely manifest in numerous other ways in so many different providers' environments that just really got you sort of scratching your head and realizing that, yeah, there's going to be more of that to come, right? So, okay, what are the risks? I mean, look, where do you want to start? I mean, the reality here is that it comes down independently to what your organization relies on in the manifestation of cloud services. For some organizations, you'll have one service that handles exactly one thing or two things, but for quite a lot of organizations, there's increasingly sort of this coalescence of services within maybe one platform. And that's happening more, by the way. So it's actually interesting, the timing of us having this conversation. Since the beginning of the year, for a lot of reasons, many organizations are sort of stepping back and saying, hey, look, we want to do some vendor consolidation. We have too many services all over the place. We're going to see what we can get with this service or this service because we're fairly heavily invested in them. Microsoft being a great example, the number of CIOs that are saying, hey, we've already got this E5 license. Can we not just use that for this or for this or for this versus this other provider or that other provider? And that all sounds great until you realize that there are more eggs in that one basket than you probably feel comfortable with as either a security professional or even just an IT operations or engineering professional. But that's the nature of business today. People are, in fact, doing a lot of this vendor consolidation effort, or really just trying to, sort of reel in all the disparate services they have. And so you could very easily find yourself in a situation where everything that we see here, whether it's, IAM, various forms of threat detection, network security, and of course, some of the core secure web gateway or SWG services that we mentioned a moment ago, they're all sort of going through a lot of the same places, if not the same place. But what happens if that single point of failure fails, right? Nobody likes to think about those discussions. What happens if it doesn't work? What happens if you wake up and none of your users can get to anything? Or maybe even worse, they can get to everything. So I think, those use cases really manifest here. And what are the costs of that? What could happen in those cases where, maybe you have absolutely no visibility, everything's shut down. So, it's sort of extremes here, right? On both sides. Nobody can get to anything. Nobody can do any work. That's an outage. Whereas over here, it's more of a, okay, it does a fail open. And you absolutely don't want that to happen either. So I think you have to take those things into account. But the big one that stands out, at least in my experience, and again, Chris, you may have some experience here too, just in terms of what you're hearing, the one that gets the most attention from the business side is the outage. Can't get to things. It doesn't work. We've got a broker, we've got an intermediary, and I've got a bunch of people trying to do business of whatever sort, and they cannot get to what they need to get to in order to get their jobs done. And what we're realizing is that there's not a lot of sort of failover opportunities. There's not a lot of, we can just write it down on paper and it'll, catch up later. You can't do that kind of stuff. Are you hearing the same thing?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the ones that have been coming up the most recently is more about getting to business critical applications, whether that's like on-prem via ZTNA, or like other SaaS apps like a Salesforce or even Teams for that matter. Um, and for us, like it's like if you break those things, then the business is dead in the water, basically. Like they just can't do anything. It's one thing to block, random web browsing, but another thing to mess with core functions.
Yeah, so I love that you mentioned Teams. The number of organizations I've spoken with where I ask the question, so Teams is out. You have no Teams. How are you going to hold meetings? What are you going to do? Do you have a backup for this? And the answer is no, we don't. You're not going to the landlines. Like people don't even have their phone numbers. Like, how do you
Right.
manage this kind of stuff? And it really does represent that risk. Collaboration platforms and things, of course. But I mean, security services, all those kinds of things are really coming about. And so, yeah, the revenue loss, I think people can start to get their head around. Like, okay, we can't do business for X amount of time. We can probably start to figure out what the monetary value of that or an approximation of monetary value looks like. Operational downtime, especially when it comes to things like data synchronization or records syncing between applications and services and things, that can sort of manifest a little bit over time. But a lot of people don't get to that third one when it comes to an outage because they think, well, it's the provider, right? So we have a provider that's out. Yes, we're feeling some pain in the moment, but if you take that a couple layers down, so in other words, your services are unavailable, and now you can't interact with clients or colleagues or hold meetings or do things in a controlled and relatively secure way. What happens if and just add dot 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 on the end of that, if there's too long of an outage there or certain types of services are out for too long and there's compromised situations or other things happen, inevitably there will in fact be some reputational damage because your customers will say, well, we can't, we haven't heard from this person over there, or hey, they seem to be down and not functioning properly. We're calling into their support team, nobody's getting back to us. Those kinds of things tend to sort of roll over, and there's a lot of sort of secondary effects that we tend to see. So you have to start thinking about redundancies across the board, failovers, multi-cloud strategies, even offline options, but increasingly, and again, I'll speak for most of the clients that I work with, if you're heavily invested in something like Salesforce, I'll just use them as an example, you don't have an offline option. If you can't get to Salesforce and do what you got to do, you don't have a backup CRM for everything that's going on in your entire business, right? You're not going to do that. And I think the same goes for collaboration platforms, even cloud storage. There's just so many different areas where people are wholly dependent on the cloud and they don't have another option for it. It's not good if you can't get to it. That's probably my Captain Obvious statement of the day right there.
Yep.
Okay, so look, these are busy slides. There's a whole lot of things in here. I'll hit some high points, but really wanted to sort of get some of this research in front of everybody just so that you had things that you could look at. And it's like, okay, look, we got some interesting stats, and these are changing all the time. So it's fun going out and doing the research. And certainly at SANS, we do a lot of this. I mean, we're constantly sort of, we're on the intake of students coming to classes. I certainly am. And just the community at large, people talking to us and telling us what's going on. And what we found is that, shocker, since about 2010, so 15 years running, there's been an increased reliance on cloud services of a variety of different types. Nobody's, a stranger to that one. But interesting things have really started to crop up. In fact, if you go back, there was, I think it was I want to say 2 years ago, don't hold me to that. And this one isn't necessarily on the slide. But if anybody's read the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report, which I'm assuming probably everybody listening has, that's a great team. They pull in a lot of data about this, but fascinating. We saw, I think, like I said, I think it was either 2022 or 2023, so not long ago. But it was the first year in all those years where the majority of the incidents occurred in the cloud, right? In the cloud and related to cloud-based assets and services versus those that are traditionally on-premise, which I think just underscores that shift into the cloud, right? The attackers are going where things are and where organizations are running things. And that's reflected here, right? This year, 47% of all the data breaches we saw, we're targeting cloud-based systems. So that's going up. Gartner says, and take it for granted here. I mean, Gartner says, look, we're going to see more of this. I mean, 99% of the cloud security failures will probably come from somebody moving too fast, making a mistake, something that could easily happen. And I certainly see this all the time, not because people don't care, because they're being pushed to do more and faster. And there's interconnectedness across cloud that a lot of people don't even realize, right? So you can make one mistake here that manifests in 10 other different places. So we've seen a lot of that too. For the last couple of years, 90% of the risks remain uninsured, meaning you're not going to get recompensated if something happens here. So you've got to you've got to take this on your own and accommodate for it yourself with your own resilience strategy. And another one here, data loss and leakage, top concerns for 71% of organizations using cloud services. I mean, I think everybody's concerned about data loss and leakage, but that increase in things related to the cloud specifically tells you that that's probably where a lot of these problems are actually occurring, right? You're starting to see a lot more of that. So it looks like we got a question that came in too. So Andre, thanks for throwing a question in. SASE Solutions assumes that you're going to some cloud. Do you believe that there is there's a contradiction related to ZTNA? Should I be confident in the third-party cloud? Where is the zero trust? Where is the zero trust, Andre? I don't know. Good question. But what you're bringing up is actually very relevant, because if you're shifting towards zero trust, you're shifting into a ZTNA solution. And there are several out there. Obviously, Zscaler is one of them. We mentioned them, but plenty of others that are in that sort of SASE SSE space. What you're doing is you're positioning all of your end users into a brokered security model, right? The fabric of the cloud somewhere, somehow, is now taking on more and more responsibility for core controls that we used to rely on, that sort of core like hub and spoke model in the data center. So where is the zero trust? That's a good question. I mean, it could happen at the endpoint. It could happen in the cloud, somewhere in between. There's a lot of that stuff that's going on. But the resilience conversation here comes into play with where you're connecting to and what those services are doing before you're moving on elsewhere. I think you're obviously going to some cloud, usually more than one cloud, and it could be an infrastructure as a service. It could be a number of different SaaS solutions, but all of that is going to and through a cloud brokered model. So whether you want to call that SASE, whether you want to call that SSE, whether you want to call that just ZTNA, I think there's a lot of things to take into account there. But the reality is you're going to and through a provider that could have a problem one day, right? And I think you have to ask yourself, what happens if that problem occurs? Does it shut us down? Does it lead to exposure that we don't want? Is our threat surface greater? What does our risk look like? All comes into play on that. I don't know if you have comments on that, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I think I like your comment of calling it a brokered security model. That basically what you're doing is you're outsourcing some of the responsibilities that you classically would have owned yourself, when you're the one that owns that infrastructure and secures it. Especially in a zero trust model, there's a lot of things that you have to do in order to kind of fulfill all of the requirements. Once you essentially outsource that, and that to some degree means SASE as well, especially when we're talking about CASB, where it's like, you're essentially outsourcing things like, data leakage, breach detection, even just access could be something like, host integrity controls. You're essentially depending on another vendor to do all of that for you. And the same would go if you actually were using a ZTNA product to basically, enforce zero trust for you against the applications that you already own, essentially.
Exactly. I mean, that shared responsibility is great until the other party's responsibility fails, right? I mean, that's ultimately what it comes down to. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and I don't think we can make assumptions in that regard. I mean, everybody has a bad day sometimes. But you can say that and it sounds fine until it's not. And so that brings us to everybody's favorite topic, which is regulatory and compliance considerations. And they're getting stricter, right? So this is certainly the case in a number of different countries and regions around the world. Because of the dependency on cloud services, the regulators have taken note. And so they're starting to include requirements with these various types of cloud services in some of the controls that are stated within these regulations. And this is just sort of the short list, which is, to some organizations, it's more of a backdrop guideline. For some, it's sort of a hard and fast. I mean, we mentioned federal agencies. I mean, as a federal agency, you don't have a ton of flexibility in things like NIST 853. So like, you're going to be going down that checklist and your auditors are going to be showing up. Whereas some other organizations that might, do business with the federal government in the US or something, they might have a little more flexibility in some of them. Ultimately depends. But when it comes to things like GDPR and privacy requirements around data, yeah, that's a huge one. So you have a big exposure because some of your controls went down and were unavailable. There's probably going to be a very low level of sympathy, and some of the fines there are huge. So I'm sure everybody's probably well aware of that. You don't want an exposure factor coming into play there. Some of the cloud resilience guidelines from CISA basically call out this exact problem and say, hey, look, you've got to have a multi-cloud strategy of some type to support this, right? You're going to have something in place, to basically, prevent a single point of failure, whether it's on-premise, whether it's cloud, doesn't really matter. You're going to need something to be there. And so this has definitely been another interesting area that we've seen evolve over the past, really couple of years. And then, sort of the final one, we're seeing some really interesting evolution, particularly in Europe. I mean, look, there's a lot of regulatory growth in Europe and sort of expansion in Europe with regards to, a lot of cybersecurity related controls and requirements, mostly data centric. We've seen a lot of that. Data centricity is a big one, and data sovereignty, but also critical infrastructure, right? So critical infrastructure, particularly around things like communications technology, which includes cloud services. They're basically saying, look, within DORA, all financial institutions, you can't come to the table with a single connectivity, strategy at all. And this goes for backbone carriers. This goes for everything, but certainly includes those broker types of cloud services that are playing a significant role in applying your security strategy and so forth. So now all of a sudden, okay, this is a big deal. We can't have a single solution that could go down and leave us exposed. We've got to have some resiliency here, which is sort of driving this forward. And it's even happening in the US as well, with the definition of what even constitutes a critical service. The cloud service providers are rapidly being categorized into the critical infrastructure bucket. And I think that's only going to continue. And that's just going to make things more and more relevant. So it's no longer a good excuse to say, well, we relied on them and they had a bad day. No. You got to think ahead and say, anything that you have as a, sort of critical path element of doing business and exposing data and so forth, you've got to have something in place to sort of, make sure that there's resilience all the way around this. So, good conversation to be having. I certainly don't like to bring the, sort of, heavy-handed hammer of governance and the regulatory side of things into play, but it's a fact of life for a lot of organizations out there. And, for what it's worth, sometimes that's the big driver that gets audit teams and risk management teams and even executives to really sort of sit up and take notice and say, are we at risk? If we have a problem here, what does that mean for us? And if there's no good answers, that can drive these kinds of initiatives within many organizations out there. So I think it's a good time to have the discussion, if nothing else. What do we do about all this? Right. So, here we'll answer all of your questions. I'm kidding, right? Probably not going to, solve everybody's problems today, but I think it's good to sort of, start driving us towards some best practices. I mean, number one, start thinking about what you get and what you need. And this actually goes back to what Chris mentioned earlier. It's that visibility factor. It's things that would factor in to, incident response, forensics investigations. If you're in a position where things go badly and it turns into an incident, God forbid, but it turns into an incident, what might you be really sad that you don't have if that happens, right? And logs, right? Logs during outages, visibility into things like identity controls and access controls, all those kinds of things factor into this. Making sure that you're doing annual disaster recovery testing. I work with lots of organizations. We talk about disaster recovery testing. Many organizations have playbooks for this. So let's make sure that this works. Okay, when's the last time you failed over? When's the last time that you emulated a legitimate outage in this regard? And people go, no. We talked about it. It was a whiteboard session. And it's like, okay, whiteboard sessions are not reality. So let's say that this is all down. Now what? And have you tested that? And people are like, absolutely not. Well, the minute somebody says, well, we're absolutely unwilling to do an actual real test, that should be bubbling up to the surface in terms of where you need to focus. So making sure that you've got that in place. And of course, aligning some of this with regulations where and, if needed is important too. Strategic things. Obviously you're not going to have a complete replica of all cloud infrastructure. Look at backup solutions and disaster recovery providers that are cloud centric. Look for backup options across SaaS, right? Look at business impact analysis results for cloud services, not just the things that you've run on premise, where you're thinking about, your DNS grid and your, former Active Directory, and like all the things that most people say, oh yeah, these things have a problem, we have a problem. Expand that and make sure you're thinking about, if there's an outage, how long could we go? What's our recovery capability? Are there workarounds? All the fun and excitement that goes with those types of exercises. Look to spread some of your security ops across different providers. So anywhere where you have a single point of failure, make a note and say, if this fails, we could be in a really bad position. And what does that ultimately mean? Could people operate for 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8 hours without that access and have, minimal hiccups or problems as a result? Or does it immediately start to affect us and then everything in between? That needs to be a known variable, not a, let's talk about it later. So you have to start thinking about this. And this could be your security workloads where, the security operations are occurring, looking at hybrid security ops. So you have some balance between maybe an existing on-prem and a cloud service or multiple cloud services. And then, even thinking about cloud agnostic security tools. Doesn't matter which cloud you're in. There's some definite dependencies that tend to come into play when you go all in on like cloud native services within Microsoft or within AWS or GCP or any of them. And I always tell clients that I work with, take that step back and say, okay, if something goes bad there, what else do you have? And a lot of times it's, well, we don't have anything else. Ask those same questions for any of your cloud centric controls and think about ways that you could, sort of extrapolate this 1 or 2 degrees to better represent, any type of environment that you're going to or from with all of your different end users, irrespective of where they're located, right? And it's a hard conversation because it's not as though you can just quickly snap your fingers and take something that you've relied upon within, Microsoft Azure or something else and bring it out a level and say, okay, now we're covered, across the board. So those conversations are important to have, especially as your cloud footprint expands. A couple other things to think about. And I like that we talked about zero trust just a little bit ago. Zero trust is really a philosophy with a whole lot of controls that can help you get there. And so it's a journey. I don't know anybody that I've worked with or continue to work with that has just achieved zero trust. They're all on the journey in some ways, and it's identity and it's workloads and it's data and it's all these and it's network, all that stuff. Again, if you're headed down this road, look at those various pillars of zero trust, and you can use the CISA model and some of the other ones that are fairly well established, and ask yourself, okay, increasingly this applies to the end users of the world and where they're trying to go and where they're coming from in order to get there. How am I going to manifest these things if my provider is unavailable or having a problem? Context-aware access controls. If you're using things like, say, conditional access within Microsoft, or you're using something within ZTNA and Zscaler or something to say, this is Dave. He's coming from the same computer, the same place, geographically. He's not exhibiting any unusual conditional aspects of where he's going or when he's going. He's fine. Versus Dave was in, Atlanta yesterday, and he's now in Beijing, and he's not on the same laptop, but those credentials look fine. Let's step it up a little. You start going down this road of zero trust and step up auth and so forth. Okay, if those are critical controls to you, where are they happening, and what happens again if they're unavailable? Is Dave still going to get the second factor, multi-factor that validates things? Maybe not. You start looking at micro-segmentation and least privilege. All of this sort of rolls into that same bucket of zero trust. Where it's happening and how it's happening, obviously it comes down to a lot of things. For each organization, it'll probably be a little bit different. But increasingly, it's in the cloud. And if the cloud is unavailable or it's not happening, is there a fallback? And what does that look like? So just to sort of start wrapping us up, at least on sort of the main part of this, and then I'm going to hand things over to Chris for a few minutes to talk about other stuff that's going on out there. Look, this is incredibly important. And if you haven't gone down the road of even tabletops, so I mentioned tabletops, I do a lot of them. You can do them yourself internally, or even do sort of almost like a weekly lunch and learn model where you come up with, hey, this thing broke. Let's just talk quickly through what it would look like. Good way to get everybody on the same page, build some alignment across different teams. Do these, have conversations around this. Look at automation. Do some assessment against this. Could I hypothetically interrupt cloud services for a user or a group of users as an attacker might? How would I do that? Lots of different ways. Whether it's attacking the cloud service or whether it's attacking the end user's access to the cloud service, again, you got a lot of variety there, but basically simulate or emulate these different types of scenarios that we're talking about yourselves so that you can find out just how resilient you might be at the moment. Make sure you're building out a resilient infrastructure so that you have better monitoring and that you can provide reporting and really the validation of these types of controls in a much more consistent format for auditors or regulators or whoever you need to. A lot of times this is just for internal continuity purposes, but if you need to be able to provide this to external entities or even internal audit teams, it's not a bad idea to bring some of these types of conversations in and just make sure that you're thinking through this kind of stuff as much as you can. Look, the long and short of it all, the cloud's not going anywhere, and we're increasingly going to rely upon a lot of cloud services to secure our end user access, or really any internet enabled access, whether it's for servers or other types of workloads, or for the end user increasingly. But if you've got a large workforce that's largely remote and they're all over the place and they're using more and more cloud services to get their day-to-day jobs done, you really have to look at all the varied controls that need to be there to make sure that they're safe. I sort of joke that the browser is really sort of the battleground of the day. It's where a lot of bad things are happening, and the attackers are absolutely leveraging those browser-based flaws and all sorts of things to take advantage of your end users. And they're doing it by luring people to sites that they shouldn't be on, or trying to push things through browser sort of exploits and stuff. You need security in the middle, right? You've got to have a variety of security controls in between the end users and the places that they're going to, whether good, bad, or in between. And so we're only going to see more of that happening. So a lot of things that are going to be growing in the next couple of years. We're certainly going to see the AI factor coming into this, where there's machine learning algorithms. We're seeing more things, we're learning more things, and we're bringing that back into improved security policy and controls implementation. We're going to see a lot more decentralization, where people are using more clouds all over the place for more things. That's already happening. It's only going to continue. And as I said earlier, we're definitely seeing stronger regulatory requirements coming into play, not just for checking the box on certain types of controls, but making sure that you have resilience around those controls in whatever form or format they're implemented in. And increasingly, again, that's in the cloud. So lots of stuff to take into account. It's busier than ever before, but it's good that everybody's starting to have these conversations and talk through this. So Chris, I'm going to hand things off to you for a few minutes here.
All right, thanks, Dave. So just a quick reminder of who we are. So we're Symantec. It's part of Broadcom. Broadcom basically acquired Symantec, which had acquired Blue Coat and a number of other technologies. And over the last bunch of years, essentially, we've been putting them all together into a, complete SSE. So that's like remote browser isolation, that's CASB, that's a number of other components, all kind of grouped around our kind of central proxy expertise, with DLP and threat protection kind of layered across the entire state. So the idea is that we essentially put all those different things together, both in cloud, which is what I do, but also in hybrid or even pure on-prem environments, where essentially the same controls could be everywhere. And that's another way to give yourself more resiliency by basically having options, essentially. Dave, do you mind hitting the button for me? For some reason, my control isn't working. So just to give you an example, and this is kind of why this has been on our, the top of our heads, I guess. So we have a customer, huge healthcare organization in the United States, and oops, next. And essentially they came to us. So they're a very large on-premise customer for probably 15 years, maybe 20. And they're using another vendor for kind of smaller use cases like roaming users, of which they do not have very many. And then us for on-prem. And they were actually doing some of these kind of tabletop exercises that Dave was talking about, where, as a healthcare provider, they're another very highly regulated industry where, they need to be able to fulfill compliance requirements. They can't really do exceptions. They have, a wide variety of different things that they do. They're actually well on their way on the zero trust journey as well. They have to have data leakage on all the time. They need to be sure that everything works and that everything is secured 100% of the time. And so what they asked for from us was like, okay, can you be our backup for all of this? Essentially, if our network goes down or if the roaming users can't get through, can we work, use you basically? So next slide. Next slide. So the thing that we're actually doing about this, based on their requests and actually a number of others, is basically offering kind of a cheap version of CloudSwitch. So it's the exact same thing, but basically with the assumption that it's there for backup purposes. For that particular customer, were probably more concerned with having a backup for their on-premise state. That they've got hundreds of thousands of users that are going through kind of their own data centers right across North America. And if they were to, I don't know, have a DNS outage or a BGP outage or something else, they would like to be able to basically flip that up to us for hours, days, whatever, and ensure that everything continues to work, continues to be monitored and secured. So it is they basically will, be kind of sitting there ready for them if they need to come on. And when I was thinking about it, like we've actually gone through this before. That 5 years ago, something happened, and essentially we had, the cloud customers were fine as all the users were essentially working from home. But all of these on-prem organizations basically realized that everyone was not coming into the office, and their VPNs were not going to necessarily be able to handle it, and they needed to be able to pivot quickly. And so at the time, we essentially, because it all happened very, very quickly, that basically we had to basically increase our infrastructure, 20x over the course of a couple of weeks, if not quicker, and we did it. And so this is rather similar, where we take the lessons that we learned back then, and apply them to our current infrastructure, which is actually quite a bit better than even back then, to be able to kind of handle those kinds of scenarios. So the idea is that any customer could essentially buy this, just have it, set it out, make sure, do a disaster recovery exercise, make sure that everything is working, and then come back if they need it, and then use it for however long they need to, and kind of go from there. So that is all I have, Dave. Oh, the one other thing I wanted to mention was that stay tuned for those other seminars, or whatever you want to call these. We're going to be talking about ZTNA, DLP, everywhere, a variety of other topics over the next few months. So thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Awesome. That brings us to our formal Q&A. If we've got some questions that are in here. I think I see some questions. I don't know, Carol, you want me to read those? You want me to just jump right into them?
I'll have you jump into them, Dave. Thanks.
Cool. Okay. So Chris, let's hang out and see what the audience has sent into us. The first question that came in, what are some of the common misconceptions organizations may have about cloud-based resiliency? That's an interesting question. I guess I don't even think about misconceptions other than maybe not having thought about it as much. Chris, you might have a better
I can think of a
better
couple
clue on
offhand.
that.
Yeah. Um, so they're almost direct opposites. So one misconception is that you can do cloud-based resiliency by basically just doubling up on your infrastructure across availability zones. The idea being that, there's multiple zones in any of the providers in any region really. And you'd spread your infrastructure across two. And that gets you data resiliency. I personally know better. That really you need to be in multiple regions. That entire zones have gone down. I can think of two off the top of my head that really hurt us. London a couple years ago in GCP, and then actually the US East Amazon outage where entire regions went out. And at that point, if that's the only region you're in, that's a problem. And we've even seen like kind of lesser versions where it wasn't the whole region, but you know, if you have all of your infrastructure in a region and that particular infrastructure has a problem, it's really hard. The other one's almost the opposite, that it's better to have more than one cloud provider. And in theory, that sounds great. It's like, okay, well, if Amazon has a problem, I just move over to Microsoft. The problem is in the details. That practically speaking, that's a really expensive way to go. And I know that a lot of people don't want to hear that, but that anything that you have that is that portable is going to be much more expensive to run. And you're going to get killed moving data back and forth and maintaining essentially twice as much stuff. And so, I think, there's definitely ways to kind of thread these needles. But those are definitely things I've heard from customers recently when asking me questions about our resiliency.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, the misconceptions. Yeah, it's interesting because most of the times, as I mentioned, it's just, didn't think about that like we should have, versus we are thinking about it, but we're not doing it the right way. So yeah,
Right.
it's a great answer. All right, so let's get to the next one, and this is a great one too. This is obviously somebody that's thinking further out. How do we see cloud resilience evolving over the next 5 to 10 years? What's going to be involved in that? Is it going to be driven by maybe regulations? Is it going to be just sort of the tactical elements? I don't know. Again, Chris, if you've got thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that regulation is definitely going to be a big part of this. That's something that has gotten noisier and noisier for me specifically. As we start dealing with, I mean, it's not even just regulations in different countries or, zones. Like now we're getting regulations from, specific states and provinces. And everyone is in the act and none of them are the same. And so I think you know, I think that's becoming, that's just getting formalized, I think is really what's happening with that. Though the biggest problem is it's just really expensive to deal with that. But it is what it is. I think, every place has the right to ask that sort of stuff. I think that as, as we've all kind of gotten more and more used to running stuff in other people's infrastructure, I do think that everyone's becoming at least more rigorous in how they treat cloud resilience. I know we are. That, and that's a good thing. I think that back in the day, especially when I was, kind of dealing with more on-prem stuff, I'd see organizations that I thought were doing pretty great with this, and organizations that wanted to but weren't, and organizations that weren't even thinking about it. And I think that as kind of cloud ops has become a legit job title, and a lot more organizations that have 5, 10, 15 years of experience with this stuff, that we're becoming more and more professional, especially in kind of the SaaS world. Whereas there's been a greater and greater acceptance of, buying SaaS apps and subscriptions and basically outsourcing it. That means that the people who are actually providing those got to be better. They just have to.
Yeah, and just to sort of come full circle on this in terms of regulations driving some of this. I mean, we're seeing it happen, right? I don't think it's a question of if it's going to happen. It's just when a lot of these things get manifested globally. I don't think it's going to be an acceptable answer. And it's not just even for the regulators. Candidly, we're also seeing the same thing come in from insurance carriers and others, which are saying, hey, look, you're exposed here and we're uncomfortable with it. And therefore your premiums are X higher. And that immediately gets everybody's attention, right? Wow, shocker. So yeah, I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the future, most definitely. And I don't think it's going to be a long future, truthfully. I mean, we talked, 5-10 years was sort of where the question was couched. I think it's going to be maybe 2 to 3 easily.
I agree.
Well, thanks so much, Chris, for hanging out with me. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks everybody for joining us today.
Yep. Cheers.
All right. Thank you so much, Dave and Chris, for your great presentation, and to Broadcom for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.
Thanks all.